She walked into the room, her heart pounding, every step echoing with the weight of the moment. This could be the breakthrough she'd worked so hard for, the opportunity that could change everything. But as her hand reached out, ready to seal the deal, the CEO, powerful, untouchable, and seasoned, did something that froze her in her tracks. Without a word, she pulled back, refusing to shake Jasmine's hand. The air thickened, the silence deafening. In that split second, everything shifted. What was supposed to be a moment of triumph turned into an excruciating rejection. Jasmine, a black investor, stood motionless, the sting of betrayal slicing through her. But what the CEO didn't realize, what no one saw coming, was that this small, cold gesture would set off a chain reaction neither of them could have foreseen. What happens when the tables finally turn? Don't forget to subscribe for more compelling stories and hit the bell icon to never miss an update.
Jasmine had worked tirelessly for years, pouring every ounce of herself into her dream. She wasn't just another investor in the tech world. She was a black woman, a trailblazer in an industry where people like her were often underestimated. Every morning she dressed with purpose, wore her confidence like armor, and went into battle with the world of business, where people judged her by everything but her abilities. She had learned quickly that the rules were never the same for her as they were for others. The obstacles were higher, the expectations different. But Jasmine was no stranger to fighting for what was hers. She had always known that her journey would be harder than most, but that wasn't something that would stop her. She had come too far to let anyone hold her back. As she approached the towering glass skyscraper, the weight of the moment settled in. The sleek reflection of the building loomed before her like a symbol of the barriers she'd fought against. This was her chance to make it to the next level, a chance to prove that she belonged here just as much as anyone else. Catherine Ellis, the CEO, sat at the head of the conference table, staring down at the documents in front of her, her posture sharp, her face a mask of cool professionalism. She was the type of woman who had built her empire through sharp decisions, ruthless ambition, and the willingness to step over anyone who got in her way. Catherine's reputation preceded her. She was known for her brilliance, for cutting through competition with surgical precision. Jasmine couldn't help but feel the weight of this woman's presence. It wasn't just about business. It was about legacy, about power, and about maintaining control. Catherine's gaze never wavered from the papers, her cold blue eyes locked on the figures, calculations, and plans laid before her. She seemed so far removed from everything else, from everything that mattered to Jasmine. There was no smile, no friendly greeting, just an unspoken challenge that made the space between them feel colder than it already was. As Jasmine stood at the door to the boardroom, she hesitated for just a moment. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took in the cold, sterile room before her. The polished marble floor, the sleek glass walls, the imposing modern furniture, it all felt a bit too much, a bit too clinical. But she steadied herself, lifting her chin and reminding herself that she had earned her place here. This was her time. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, her fingers brushing it gently as she took a deep breath. She had imagined this moment for so long, but now that it was here, the reality seemed different. She was about to face Catherine Ellis, the CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the industry. This was the moment that could define her career. She gathered all the strength she had and opened the door, walking in with purpose. She was ready to face whatever came next, determined to take her shot. The moment Jasmine entered the room, she offered her hand to Catherine, her fingers steady, her eyes unwavering. It was a professional gesture, one that she had practiced countless times in meetings with high-powered executives. But as Catherine extended her hand, it was almost mechanical, the handshake brief and cold, with none of the warmth or energy that Jasmine had expected. It was as if Catherine was already dismissing her without so much as a glance. Jasmine didn't let it show, but something inside her tightened. This wasn't just business, it felt personal. As they both took their seats at the long conference table, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that she was already being judged, already being sized up in a way she wasn't used to. She had worked too hard for this moment, and yet Catherine's detachment felt like a subtle message. She wasn't welcome. But Jasmine wasn't about to back down. She had a story to tell, and she wasn't going to let anything or anyone stop her from delivering it. Jasmine began to speak, her voice steady as she outlined her pitch, an innovative partnership that could benefit both companies. She spoke with passion, with conviction, knowing that every word she said could be the key to unlocking the future she had been fighting for. Her ideas were groundbreaking, bold, and exactly what the company needed to stay ahead of the curve. She had come prepared, knowing that this was her chance to prove herself, to show Catherine that she wasn't just some token investor but someone who could change the game. As she spoke, she could feel Catherine's gaze on her, but there was no nod of approval, no sign that Catherine was even paying attention. Jasmine's heart raced, but she pushed forward. This wasn't just about making a deal, it was about changing perceptions. It was about making sure that people like her weren't ignored anymore. This wasn't just business, it was a statement. And Jasmine was going to make sure that statement was heard loud and clear. But as Jasmine continued, something started to shift. Her words seemed to hang in the air, and Catherine's attention drifted. Her eyes flicked toward the clock, then to the papers in front of her, and then out the window. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Jasmine noticed. Every time she finished a point, Catherine barely acknowledged it, barely looked up. It was as if Jasmine's words were just noise, something to fill the space while Catherine focused on her own thoughts. Jasmine's stomach twisted as she realized what was happening. This wasn't about the ideas she was presenting, it was about something deeper. Something that went beyond the professional, beyond the business. She was being dismissed. Not for her ideas, but for who she was. The realization hit her hard, but she refused to let it show. She was still in control, still had a chance to make her mark. But the tension in the room was undeniable. It wasn't just the silence, it was the weight of everything unspoken. Jasmine pressed on, undeterred, though her mind was racing. She had been prepared for the challenges she would face in this room. This was the world she had fought to enter, the corporate battlefield that often overlooked people like her. She had spent years building her career, earning her place among the giants. She had learned how to navigate the nuances of power dynamics, how to read the room, and how to speak with authority. But even with all that preparation, she couldn't have anticipated this, the subtle but unmistakable shift in Catherine's behavior. Every time Jasmine spoke, Catherine's attention seemed to drift further away. At first, Jasmine tried to shake it off, thinking maybe it was just a momentary lapse. But as the conversation went on, it became clear that Catherine wasn't interested in what she had to offer. Jasmine's stomach churned as the silence in the room stretched longer. She could feel Catherine's gaze flicking back to her papers, then to the clock, and then back again with no acknowledgement of Jasmine's words. Every time Jasmine finished a thought, Catherine would offer a brief response, one that felt more like a dismissive afterthought than a true engagement with her pitch. The message was clear. Jasmine's ideas didn't matter. It wasn't about the merit of what she was saying, it was about something else. Something unspoken but ever-present. And then, in a sudden, sharp motion, Catherine cut her off mid-sentence. "What you're describing is interesting, but not what we need right now," she said. Her tone was clinical, detached, almost as if she were talking about something trivial, something irrelevant. "We need visionaries, Jasmine. People who can see beyond the numbers and think about what this company needs in the long term. People who aren't just trying to fit in, but who understand how to make an impact. You see, this company is about more than just business. It's about legacy." Catherine's voice trailed off as she leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping against the armrest, eyes narrowing slightly as if she were contemplating something far more important than the pitch Jasmine had worked so hard on. The words hit Jasmine like a physical blow. It wasn't the rejection of her ideas that stung the most. It was the way Catherine had dismissed her so effortlessly. The implication was clear. She wasn't a part of their world. She didn't understand what they truly needed because she was an outsider. It wasn't just that Catherine didn't believe in her ideas. It was that Catherine didn't believe in her, period. Jasmine's heart sank as she realized the truth of what was happening. It wasn't that she wasn't qualified. It wasn't that her ideas weren't good enough. She had the experience, the credentials, and the vision. But there was something deeper at play. Catherine wasn't rejecting her pitch. She was rejecting her. She was rejecting who Jasmine was, where she had come from, and everything that made her different from the people in this room. It was a subtle, insidious form of racism, one that wasn't overt, but was deeply ingrained in the way the system operated. Jasmine's mind raced as she struggled to keep her composure. She had been prepared for challenges, for skepticism, even for hostility. But this was something different. This was personal. The meeting wasn't just about making a deal. It wasn't about her ideas or her qualifications. It was about power. It was about a system that had been built to keep people like Jasmine out, no matter how much they worked or how successful they became. She had always known, deep down, that there would be moments like this. Moments where no matter how good she was, no matter how hard she fought, there would always be people who saw her as less than, as different, as other. It was something she had faced her entire life. from the time she was a child trying to navigate spaces where people like her weren't meant to succeed. But today, sitting across from Catherine, Jasmine realized that the fight was bigger than just one meeting, one rejection, or one deal. This was about a system that was stacked against her, and against people like her. It wasn't about her ability or her worth. It was about the fact that she was black, and in a world that was built for people who weren't, her value would always be questioned. That thought settled deep in her chest, heavy and suffocating. For a moment, she felt the weight of every rejection, every subtle slight, every door that had been closed in her face just because of the color of her skin. She tried to push it aside, to focus on the task at hand, but Catherine's dismissive behavior was too much to ignore. It was clear that she wasn't going to give Jasmine the time or the respect that she deserved. Jasmine had been through too many moments like this to let it destroy her, but the sting was undeniable. She had worked so hard to get to this point, to be seen as an equal, to have her voice heard. And yet here she was, in a room with someone who saw her as less than. The message was clear. No matter how much she had achieved, no matter how qualified she was, there would always be someone like Catherine who saw her as an outsider. The realization settled in Jasmine's mind like a bitter truth, one that she would have to confront whether she was ready for it or not. But she wasn't done. She couldn't afford to be done. Jasmine had fought too long and too hard to be silenced now. She pushed through the tightness in her chest and continued speaking, despite the growing tension in the room. She wasn't going to let Catherine's dismissal define her. She wasn't going to let this moment be the end of her journey. She had too much to offer, and she wasn't about to back down now. Jasmine's mind raced as Catherine's words echoed in her ears, but she couldn't seem to form a coherent thought. She had been blindsided. All the preparation, all the hard work, and all the passion she had poured into this pitch, it had meant nothing to Catherine. She had expected pushback, even skepticism, but this was different. The coldness in Catherine's demeanor, the indifference to her ideas, it was something Jasmine had never fully prepared for. She had been prepared to fight for her vision, to convince Catherine of the value of her partnership, but now it felt like Catherine wasn't even listening. This wasn't about business. It was about something much deeper. Jasmine tried to hold it together, but the weight of the moment was too much. The words Catherine had just spoken, the way she had dismissed her, had cut deeper than Jasmine cared to admit. It wasn't just a rejection of her pitch, it was a rejection of her. Jasmine could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, a mix of anger and frustration, but she didn't let it show. She couldn't. She had to stay composed. She couldn't let Catherine see how much her words had affected her. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. Jasmine felt like she was suffocating in this sterile, polished space. This was supposed to be a meeting about opportunity, about growth, about partnership. But instead, it had become a moment where Jasmine realized just how small the world she had fought to enter really was. As Catherine sat there, her cold eyes flicking back to the paperwork in front of her, Jasmine couldn't help but wonder, would this ever be enough? Would she ever be seen as an equal, or would she always be the outsider in a world that had been built to keep people like her out? The thought lingered in the back of her mind as she continued speaking, even though she knew it wasn't getting through. It wasn't just about this meeting. It was about everything that had led her here, everything that had been stacked against her from the very beginning. Jasmine stood up slowly, her hands shaking ever so slightly as she gathered her papers and slid them into her portfolio. The weight of the rejection was almost too much to bear, but she refused to let it show. She had been here before. She had faced rejection after rejection, and she had always bounced back. But this felt different. She had known it wouldn't be easy, but to be dismissed so easily, to be made to feel so small, it was more than just business. It was personal. She had poured everything into this moment, and now it was slipping away. The room around her seemed to stretch, the silence between her and Catherine growing unbearable. Jasmine couldn't bring herself to say anything more. What was the point? Catherine had already made up her mind. It didn't matter what Jasmine said now. She had done everything she could, but in the end it hadn't been enough. Her heart was heavy as she stuffed the last of her notes into her bag. There was nothing more to be done here. As she turned to leave, she felt a sense of finality settling over her. She had given it her all, but the door had been slammed shut. And all she could do now was walk out of the room and try to hold her head high, even though everything inside her wanted to break. Jasmine stepped out of the building, the heavy doors closing behind her with a sound that echoed through the hallway. The bustling city streets stretched out before her, but she couldn't quite bring herself to move. She stood there for a moment, feeling the cold air against her skin, the weight of the day pressing down on her. The glass and steel skyscrapers rose up around her, towering like silent witnesses to everything she had just experienced. Her feet remained planted on the pavement, as though she was trying to find solid ground beneath her in a world that had just shifted on its axis. She didn't know how long she stood there, but it was long enough for the sounds of the city to become muffled, as if she was in a different world altogether. The cars honked, the pedestrians hurried by, but for Jasmine, it felt like everything had slowed down. The rejection was still fresh, still raw, like an open wound she hadn't yet figured out how to heal. Her hands were clammy, and her fingers trembled as she clutched her portfolio. She had come to this meeting with hope, with the belief that she was about to take the next step in her career, that she was going to break through the glass ceiling she had been fighting against for so long. But now, standing on the sidewalk, she felt like that ceiling had come crashing down on her instead. It wasn't just a missed opportunity. It was the realization that no matter how much she had achieved, how hard she had fought, there were still forces beyond her control that would hold her back. As she looked up at the towering building behind her, Jasmine couldn't help but feel the weight of the rejection, the sting of being seen as less than. It wasn't just that Catherine had rejected her pitch. It was that Catherine had dismissed her completely, ignored everything she had worked for, everything she had achieved. It was a slap in the face, a reminder that no matter how hard she tried to break through, there would always be doors that were closed to her simply because of the color of her skin. The thought hit her like a punch in the gut, and she took a deep breath trying to steady herself. She had faced so much worse in her life, she had fought so much harder than this. But today, something had shifted inside her, and it wasn't just the rejection of her ideas, it was the rejection of her very being. Jasmine pushed through the emotional wave threatening to overwhelm her. She had been here before, had felt this pain before, but this time, something was different. She wasn't going to let this moment define her. She had spent too many years fighting to fit in, to prove her worth, to make people see her as equal. But today, standing there on the sidewalk, something inside her clicked. Maybe it wasn't about fitting in at all. Maybe it was about creating her own space, a space where people like her didn't have to prove themselves, a space where their value wasn't measured by the color of their skin, but by the power of their ideas. This wasn't the end of her journey, it was the beginning of something much bigger. She had to keep going, had to rise above this moment. She wasn't going to be defined by Catherine's rejection. She was going to redefine the rules of the game. Jasmine took a deep breath and straightened her back. She wasn't going to let the weight of this moment break her. She had come too far to let one person's dismissive attitude stop her. She had fought for every inch she had gained, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. The world might not be ready for what she had to offer, but that didn't matter. She was ready. She had always been ready. And now it was time to show them. With one last glance at the building behind her, Jasmine turned and walked away, her head held high, her steps steady. The city was still loud, still fast, but Jasmine felt a renewed sense of purpose, a fire building inside her. She had come too far to turn back now. The rejection had only fueled her determination, and she wasn't going to stop until her voice was heard. Later that evening, as the weight of the day began to settle in, Jasmine sat at her desk in her apartment, the dim light of her desk lamp casting a soft glow on the room. She stared blankly at her phone, her thoughts a whirlwind of anger, frustration, and confusion. The email notification had popped up while she was trying to unwind, trying to push aside the feeling of rejection that had lingered in her chest since she left the boardroom. The subject line caught her attention: urgent, immediate action required. Her pulse quickened as she tapped on the email, unsure of what to expect but knowing deep down that whatever it wasn't going to make her feel any better. The message was short but powerful, and as she read it, Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. The words were clear, unsettling, but they also carried a weight of truth that Jasmine couldn't ignore. It was from an anonymous source at the company, someone who had witnessed the discrimination from behind the scenes. The email confirmed everything Jasmine had suspected, that Catherine's rejection wasn't about her abilities, her ideas, or even her qualifications. It was about something deeper, something that had been woven into the very fabric of the company. The email revealed that the CEO had made it clear during a board meeting that someone of Jasmine's background would never succeed in the company, no matter how talented they were. And the most chilling part of the message was that this wasn't just about her. It was about the system that had been in place for years, a system that systematically excluded people like Jasmine. The words hit her like a ton of bricks. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her as the reality of it sank in. She had known something wasn't right, had felt the coldness in Catherine's behavior, the subtle rejection of her presence, but this email confirmed it. The corporate world wasn't just dismissing her ideas. It was actively working against her because of who she was. She wasn't just a woman of color in a predominantly white industry. She was an outsider, someone who wasn't supposed to succeed no matter how hard she worked. The world she had been trying to break into wasn't about merit. It was about power, privilege, and exclusion. And Jasmine had been trying to force her way into a system that had no place for people like her. Her stomach turned as she reread the email, each word sinking deeper into her mind. But there was something else in the message, a glimmer of hope. The email ended with a statement. "You're not alone." Jasmine wasn't the only one facing these barriers. Others within the company had been silenced, ignored, or dismissed for the same reasons. And now, Jasmine had the chance to do something about it. This wasn't just about one meeting, one rejection. It was about exposing a culture of discrimination that had been allowed to thrive for far too long. Jasmine's mind raced as she thought about what this meant. She had the evidence. She had the chance to make things right, not just for herself, but for everyone who had suffered in silence. But Jasmine knew she couldn't act in haste. This wasn't just about one CEO, one company. This was about a systemic issue, a culture that had been ingrained in the corporate world for decades. She needed to gather more evidence, more testimonies. She couldn't rush into this blindly. The stakes were too high and the risks too great. But at that moment, Jasmine knew she had no choice. She couldn't stay silent. She had to expose the truth, no matter the cost. As she stared at the email, a sense of clarity washed over her. This wasn't just about changing one company. This was about changing the system. Jasmine wasn't going to let her story be buried. She wasn't going to let this injustice stand. She was going to fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been made to feel less than. Jasmine took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. This was just the beginning. Jasmine sat back in her chair, her fingers still gripping the phone, but now she was completely still. The weight of the email had settled in her chest, filling her with a sense of urgency and unease. She had expected it in a way. She had known, deep down, that what had happened in that meeting wasn't just about a single rejection. It was part of a much larger problem, a culture of racial discrimination that had taken root in the corporate world, one that most people turned a blind eye to. But now she had the evidence. She had the proof that it wasn't just her imagination or her sensitivity. It wasn't just the normal struggles of trying to climb the corporate ladder. It was systemic, intentional, and deeply ingrained in the practices of the very company she had hoped to partner with. The email, while shocking, was not a surprise to Jasmine. She had seen the signs for years. Subtle comments, the cold dismissals, the way her achievements were always measured differently from her colleagues. She had tried to brush it off, to push through the discomfort, to convince herself that her success would eventually speak for itself. But now she knew the truth. Her success would never be enough in a world that viewed her as other. The power structures she had tried so hard to integrate into were never meant for people like her. The fact that she had made it this far, despite everything, was a testament to her strength, her resilience, and her talent. But it also highlighted a painful reality. The world she had fought to be a part of didn't really want her in it. As Jasmine reread the email, her emotions were mixed. On one hand, there was the overwhelming sense of betrayal and disbelief that this was happening. On the other hand, there was a simmering anger, an urgency that propelled her into action. The email from the anonymous source wasn't just about validating her experience. It was an opportunity. This was her chance to expose the truth, to do what so many others in her position had been too afraid to do. This was about more than her career or the rejection she had faced. It was about justice. It was about showing the world that the system could be changed, that people like her weren't going to stay silent any longer. The evidence that the email referenced was exactly what Jasmine needed. It was a collection of documents, emails, and memos detailing the ways in which the company had gone to great lengths to exclude people of color from positions of power and influence. It outlined diversity initiatives that were nothing more than corporate window dressing, designed to appease public outcry without ever changing the core structure of the company. People of color were brought in for appearances to meet quotas, but they were never given real opportunities to lead, to succeed, to make an impact. The emails she was reading were clear. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate strategy to maintain the status quo, to ensure that those who held power in the company remained in control, keeping people like her at the margins. Jasmine's hands trembled as she scrolled through the documents. Her mind raced, processing everything she was seeing. She had suspected that this kind of discrimination existed, but seeing it laid out so plainly, so systematically, made her blood boil. This wasn't just a few bad apples in the company. It was an entrenched culture that had been built over years, one that had been designed to keep talented people like her from ever truly rising. The more she read, the more Jasmine realized just how deep the rot went. It wasn't just the CEO. It wasn't just one person. It was the entire system, and it wasn't just in this company. It was in every company, in every boardroom, in every place where power was concentrated. The system had been built to exclude, to silence, to oppress. Jasmine wasn't just facing one CEO or one company. She was up against an entire structure, one that had been designed to keep people like her out. As she continued to read the damning evidence, the full scale of what she was up against began to sink in. The truth was far more insidious than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just about one woman's prejudice. It was about a pattern, a system that had been in place for decades. People who looked like her were given roles, but they were never allowed to truly succeed. They were never given the support they needed to rise through the ranks, never given the opportunity to prove themselves beyond the limits of what the system allowed. They were kept in positions that would never threaten the power of those at the top, and when they tried to break through, they were shut down, dismissed, or pushed aside. Jasmine felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she absorbed the full extent of the documents. She had known that she was up against something bigger than herself, but now it was real. The battle she was fighting wasn't just for her own success. It was for the future of everyone who had ever been held back because of their race. The system she was confronting was built to keep people like her from succeeding, to keep them in their place, to maintain the illusion that the world was a meritocracy when, in reality, it was anything but. And the more she read, the more she knew that she couldn't just let this go. She had to expose it, had to make sure that the world saw it for what it was. The documents included internal communications between the executives that made it clear they were not even trying to hide their prejudice. One memo referred to diversity quotas, not as a step toward true inclusion, but as a way to make sure the company didn't come under fire for its lack of racial diversity. Another email detailed how a black employee had been passed over for a promotion in favor of someone less qualified, with the justification that the company wasn't ready for someone like that in leadership. The more Jasmine read, the more she realized just how deep the culture of exclusion went. This wasn't just about one bad CEO. It was about a culture that had permeated every corner of the company, from the boardroom to the hiring process, to the way promotions were handled. Jasmine's heart pounded as she processed the weight of it all. She wasn't just a victim of a single instance of racism. She was up against a system that had been built to keep her and others like her out. But in that moment, something inside her clicked. This was bigger than just her career. This was a fight for justice, a fight to expose a system that had been allowed to thrive for far too long. She wasn't going to let this go. She had the evidence. She had the truth, and now it was time to share it with the world. As the reality of the situation settled in, Jasmine's resolve only grew stronger. The risk of exposing this system was enormous. She knew that speaking out could cost her everything, her career, her reputation, her safety. But Jasmine wasn't afraid. She had been afraid before, afraid of being rejected, of being dismissed, of being told she wasn't good enough. But now she realized that those fears were the chains that had been holding her back. The only way forward was to fight, to expose the truth, and to make sure that the system could never operate in silence again. She had the power to make change, and now she was going to use it. With the evidence in hand, Jasmine knew the next step was crucial. She couldn't do this alone. She needed to find others who had witnessed the same injustices, people who had experienced the same systemic racism and discrimination that she had. It wasn't enough to have one voice. She needed a chorus. She needed to build a case that could no longer be ignored. So she reached out to those who had been silenced, those who had lived through the same struggles, those who had been overlooked and passed over, people who had been denied opportunities because of their race. One of those people was Marissa, a former employee who had worked at the company for over 5 years before being quietly let go. Marissa had been one of the brightest stars in the company, but despite her outstanding performance, she had been passed over for multiple promotions. Like Jasmine, Marissa had sensed the unspoken rules that governed the company's decisions, rules that weren't about talent, experience, or qualifications. They were about who you knew, where you came from, and the color of your skin. Jasmine had been in contact with Marissa a few times before, and now it was time to meet in person. It wasn't just about comparing notes. It was about building something larger than themselves, something that could expose the truth to the world. Jasmine met Marissa at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, away from prying eyes and the corporate world they had both tried so hard to break into. As soon as Jasmine walked in, she spotted Marissa sitting at a corner table, her eyes scanning the crowd. Marissa was wearing a simple blouse and jeans, her face a mixture of weariness and resolve. Jasmine took a deep breath as she approached. The weight of what they were about to do was settling in, but it wasn't fear that Jasmine felt. It was a sense of clarity, of purpose. This was bigger than them. This was about something much larger. When Jasmine sat down, Marissa gave her a small, weary smile. "You're doing the right thing," she said quietly. "I'm with you." The words were comforting, but Jasmine knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. The risk of speaking out was enormous, but there was no turning back now. As the days passed, Jasmine felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her more than ever. She had spent countless hours gathering evidence, piecing together the stories of those who had been silenced, and compiling the documents that would expose the company's deeply ingrained systemic racism. But now, standing in her apartment, with papers scattered around her desk and evidence laid out on the floor, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty that lingered in the back of her mind. She had been through so many challenges in her life, so many moments when she had been told that she wasn't good enough, when the system had pushed her down just because of who she was. But this was different. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all the people who had been silently oppressed, all the voices that had been ignored and silenced for far too long. It was about the future, about creating a world where people like her, people of color, women, minorities, no longer had to fight for a seat at the table. Jasmine walked back and forth across her apartment, her mind racing, replaying the events of the past few weeks. The meeting with Catherine had shattered her, but in a way it had also galvanized her. She had never imagined that the fight she had been preparing for, the career she had worked for, would lead her to this moment of reckoning, where she had the power to expose the truth. But at the same time, Jasmine couldn't ignore the risk. She had everything to lose. She had worked too hard to get here, had made too many sacrifices, and now, standing at the precipice of this fight, she wasn't sure if she was ready to risk it all. What if it backfired? What if the backlash was more than she could handle? What if the company she had trusted for so long turned on her, or worse, the people who had supported her? But then she thought of the faces of people like Marissa, like the others who had come to her with their stories, their pain, their truth. They had spent years hidden in the shadows, forced to swallow their frustrations and their hurt because speaking out was too dangerous. Jasmine had lived through that silence for too long herself, and she knew that now was the time to change that. The truth she held in her hands, these documents, these stories, these voices, was not just hers to carry. It was for everyone who had been told they were not ready or not good enough simply because of their race. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the people who had been dismissed, for those who would never be given a chance unless someone took a stand. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds as Jasmine's thoughts spiraled, but she couldn't allow herself to get lost in indecision. She had to act. She had already waited too long, and with each passing day, the opportunity to expose the company and its practices was slipping away. But even as the adrenaline surged in her veins, a part of her hesitated. The fear was real. She had spent years building a career, climbing the ladder, playing by the rules, and now she was about to burn it all down. And for what? To expose a company that would never listen. To take on a system that had been built to maintain its own power, regardless of who it hurt. Was she truly ready for this fight, or was she just too angry to see it through? Jasmine looked down at the papers spread out in front of her. The weight of the evidence was heavy in her hands, but it was more than just physical weight. It was the weight of history. It was the weight of every black woman who had been overlooked in corporate boardrooms, every person of color who had been dismissed because they didn't fit the mold. It was the weight of every voice that had been silenced, every injustice that had been allowed to thrive in the shadows. The thought of remaining silent, of allowing this moment to pass without taking action, was unbearable. She walked back to her desk and sat down, picking up the phone. She had already made the decision. She wasn't going to let fear stop her. She wasn't going to let the system break her. She dialed the number for the investigative journalist she had been in touch with, the one who had promised to help her expose the truth. She had spent hours crafting a plan, but now it was time to put that plan into action. She needed someone with the credibility and the platform to take this story to the public. This wasn't just about one company. It was about dismantling the structures that allowed discrimination to thrive. Jasmine's hands were steady now as she pressed the call button. When the journalist answered, she spoke with a calm she didn't entirely feel. "I'm ready," she said. Her voice was firm, but there was an edge to it, a tightness that spoke of the nerves she was holding in check. "It's time to go public. I have everything you need." She could feel the weight of her words as she spoke them, and she knew that there was no turning back now. The moment she had feared and longed for had arrived. The journalist was silent for a moment before responding with a simple, "We'll make sure this gets out." With that, Jasmine ended the call and sat back in her chair, her breath coming in slow, deliberate breaths. She had taken the first step, but the road ahead would be anything but easy. The company would fight back. They would try to discredit her, to silence her, to make her story seem insignificant. But Jasmine wasn't afraid anymore. She had been afraid of this moment for so long, but now that it was here, she realized that fear was just another tool they used to keep people like her in check. She stood up, taking a deep breath, and walked to the window. The city stretched out before her, the lights twinkling in the distance. The skyline was as majestic as it had always been, but now Jasmine saw it differently. She wasn't just one person trying to make her way through a system that didn't want her. She was part of a larger movement, a larger fight, one that was about to change the world. She had the power to do this. She had the strength to expose the truth. And now it was time to take that first step into the unknown. The days passed quickly as Jasmine prepared herself for the next step. She knew that once the story broke, everything would change. She was no longer just an investor with a pitch, she was now a whistleblower, a voice for those who had been silenced for far too long. The weight of the responsibility felt heavier than anything she had carried before, but it was also liberating. For the first time in her life, she wasn't fighting to prove her worth. She was fighting for justice. She was fighting to expose the truth about the world that had been built on exclusion, a world that had been built to keep people like her from succeeding. The morning of the meeting with the investigative journalist, Jasmine felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. She had made her decision, and there was no turning back. She knew that the world was going to be watching, and that the consequences of her actions could be far-reaching. But as she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her blazer, she reminded herself that this wasn't about her. This was about everyone who had been overlooked, dismissed, and forgotten. This was about creating a world where people of color no longer had to fight for a seat at the table. And that was worth fighting for. The cafe where she was meeting the journalist was quiet, tucked away on a side street. The atmosphere was calm, and the low hum of conversation and clinking mugs created a warm, intimate ambience. It was the perfect place for a conversation that would change everything. Jasmine sat down at the table, the weight of the documents she had brought with her pressing down on the surface between them. The journalist arrived shortly after, a man in his early 40s, dressed in a simple but professional suit. His calm demeanor and focused expression immediately put Jasmine at ease. He sat down across from her, offering a polite smile before getting straight to the point. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" he asked, his voice soft but serious. Jasmine nodded. "I've spent my entire life fighting to prove I belong. This isn't about me anymore. It's about exposing the system that keeps people like me out. It's about giving a voice to the people who have been silenced." The journalist leaned in, nodding slowly. "I understand. Let's make sure this gets out to the right people. You have the evidence. You have the truth. Now let's make sure the world sees it." Jasmine slid the stack of documents across the table, each page heavy with the stories of those who had been ignored, dismissed, or outright harmed by the system. The journalist took the papers, his eyes scanning over the first few pages. He didn't speak for a moment, but Jasmine could see the shock and anger flicker across his face as he processed what he was reading. This is exactly what we need," he said after a long pause. "We'll get this out there. The world has to see this. They can't keep hiding it." Jasmine felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. The road ahead would be difficult. The company would fight back and the backlash would be intense. But Jasmine had already made her decision. There was no turning back. The truth was out now and nothing could change that. The story broke the next morning, and the reaction was immediate. Headlines flashed across screens, splashed across the front pages of newspapers, and flooded social media platforms. The article detailing the company's systemic racism and discriminatory practices was shared and commented on by thousands, and the world took notice. Jasmine's name was no longer just associated with an investment pitch. It was now associated with a fight for justice, a fight that was bigger than any one person or company. The media frenzy was overwhelming. Jasmine's phone rang non-stop. As news outlets reached out for interviews, activists sent messages of support, and former employees reached out to thank her for giving them a voice. It was overwhelming, but Jasmine couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in everything she had done. She had risked everything to expose the truth, and now the world was listening. But even as the support poured in, Jasmine knew that the real battle was just beginning. The company had already issued a statement, attempting to downplay the scandal, promising that they would address the issue internally. But Jasmine wasn't fooled. The company had been operating this way for years, and no apology or PR campaign could change the fact that they had built their success on the exploitation of people like her. She wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not now, not ever. Jasmine stood before the crowd, her heart pounding in her chest as the overwhelming realization of what she had started began to settle in. The rally in support of her efforts had grown larger than anyone had anticipated. People from all walks of life had gathered, former colleagues, activists, allies, and those who had faced the same challenges she had. They were all there, standing in solidarity, demanding change. Their voices filled the air, chanting for justice, for equality, for a world where no one would ever have to fight for recognition because of the color of their skin. Jasmine's breath caught in her throat as she looked out over the crowd. She had always felt like an outsider in the spaces she had entered, but today she felt different. Today she was no longer alone. The support of the people around her, the faces that mirrored her struggles, gave her a sense of strength she had never known. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all of them. Her voice cracked as she stepped forward, and as she spoke, she could feel the energy of the crowd lifting her, empowering her to keep going. The world was watching, and for the first time in her life, Jasmine knew she wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was leading it, and nothing was going to stop her now. Standing outside the company's headquarters, Jasmine felt a deep sense of both defiance and accomplishment. The glass and steel tower loomed before her, a symbol of everything she had fought against. It was here in this very building, where she had been told she didn't belong, where her ideas had been dismissed, where she had been made to feel like she was less than. But today was different. She stood tall, her posture strong, her eyes fixed on the building that had once made her feel small. The corporate world had tried to push her down, to make her believe she couldn't succeed. But now, as she stood there, she realized that this was her victory. She had fought for a seat at the table, and while that fight wasn't over, she had changed the game. Her presence here in front of this towering building was a statement. She was no longer just another black woman trying to make it in a world that wasn't built for her. She was a force to be reckoned with, a woman who had taken on the system and was winning. The wind picked up and Jasmine's coat fluttered around her as she took one last look at the building. She wasn't done yet. The fight was far from over. But today, for the first time, she felt like she had won. The spotlight illuminated Jasmine's face as she stepped onto the stage, her heart racing in her chest. The cameras flashed as she took the microphone in her hand. The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. She had never imagined that speaking out would lead to this, standing in front of so many people, so many eyes watching, waiting for her to speak. But as she stood there, a sense of calm washed over her. This was her moment. This was her chance to make sure the world heard the truth. Jasmine took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the audience. She could see the faces in the crowd, people who had supported her from the very beginning, and people who had only just learned about her fight. They were all there because they believed in the cause, because they believed in the power of truth. And now it was her turn to speak. "Today, I'm not just speaking for myself," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm speaking for all the voices that have been silenced, for all the people who have been told they don't belong, for every person who has been rejected because of who they are. This is our fight, and we will not be ignored any longer." As the crowd erupted in applause, Jasmine knew she had made her mark. This was just the beginning of a movement that would change everything. Later that evening, Jasmine sat by her window, looking out at the city that stretched out before her. The lights twinkled in the distance, and the hum of the streets below seemed so far away now. The past few days had been a whirlwind: interviews, protests, the overwhelming support from people who had rallied behind her cause. But tonight, she was alone with her thoughts. She wasn't sure where this path would take her, but for the first time, she felt at peace. Her hand rested on the windowsill, and her mind wandered back to the journey that had brought her here. The rejections, the doubts, the moments when she had questioned whether it was all worth it. But now, with everything that had happened, Jasmine knew that it had been worth it. She had fought not just for her career, but for something much larger. She had fought for the future, for the people who had been silenced, and for the change that was coming. The fight wasn't over, she knew that. There was still so much work to be done. But tonight, in this quiet moment, Jasmine allowed herself to reflect on how far she had come. She had changed the narrative, and that meant she had already won. The city lights sparkled like stars, and for the first time in a long while, Jasmine felt a sense of hope for the future.